Chapter 15 of Mary Ware in Texas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Aries. Mary Ware in Texas by Annie Fellows Johnston. Chapter 15 New Trails. The train to Ware left so early that Mary had to take the first streetcar passing the post. In order to reach the station in time, Gay had announced her intention of going down with her, but did not awaken until Mary, who occupied an adjoining room, was nearly dressed and the maid was bringing up a hastily prepared breakfast on a tray. But Mary could not honestly share Gay's regrets at being late. She had dressed noiselessly on purpose not to waken her. She wanted to go alone in order to have those last moments with Phil all to herself. And she was so elated when she finally got away from the house unaccompanied that she could have sung aloud. Her route took her through Alamo Plaza again, and the streets which still bore witness to the presence of the carnival. All the buildings were still gay with bunting, and flags flapped merrily in the morning sunshine. She wondered which would be the first to reach the station, and all the way down, Phil's face was before her. She could see just the way he would look, coming towards her through the crowd, tall and distinguished, and with such a jolly twinkle in his handsome eyes. And he would call out, "Hello, little vicar, I bet you to it," or some such friendly greeting as that. She did not know that she was smiling to herself, but it made no difference. There was no one to see, for the men on the car were all hidden behind their morning papers. When she reached the station, only a few people were in sight, and when she climbed into the coach at the end of the long line of freight cars, there were not more than half a dozen passengers aboard. All of them looked sleepy, and a series of gentle snores attracted her attention to an old country man, curled up on a back seat with his valise for a pillow. On her way in, she had passed through the waiting room and given a hasty look around to see if Phil were ahead of her. Glancing up at the clock, she found that she had 10 minutes to spare. 3 of these passed in getting settled and taking an inventory of her fellow passengers. Then she began to hang out of the window and anxiously watched the waiting room door. She was growing uneasy. Maybe the clerk had forgotten to call him. Maybe he was slumbering still, as Gay had prophesied. He might have missed the car he should have taken, or there might be a tie-up somewhere along the line. A colored man hurried into the coach with a chunk of ice for the water cooler. The conductor came down the platform looking at his watch and signaled something to a brakeman. Mary put her head out of the window again and looked anxiously up and down, whispering in a flutter of nervousness, "Oh, why doesn't he come? Why doesn't he come? There's only a minute or 2 left, and there won't be time for a word." She would not admit the possibility of his not coming at all until she heard the warning, "All aboard!" the ringing of the engine bell, and felt the clerk and jar which proclaimed all too plainly that the car was in motion. She was so disappointed that she could hardly keep the tears back. Her last thought before falling asleep the night before, and the first one on awakening had been that she was going to see the best man by himself a few moments, without any talkative Roberta to absorb his attention, or any other people to run away with the conversation. It was a very disconsolate little face that turned towards the open window to hide its disappointment from passively curious neighbors. She found it hard to wink the tears back when she was so deeply, grievously disappointed. Her back was turned resolutely towards the aisle, and her arms were crossed on the window sill. In that position she could not see the rear door of the car open, and someone come in from the back platform. He stood a moment, his hat in one hand and a suitcase in the other, breathing fast as if he had been running. Then, after a searching glance through the car, he went directly down the aisle and stepped beside Mary's seat. Her attitude, even to the droop of her hat brim, proclaimed her dejection so clearly that smile twitched the corners of his mouth. Then he said in a deep voice, so deep that it was fairly sepulchral, "I beg pardon, miss. May I occupy this end of the seat?" Startled by the strange voice so near, she turned a very sober and unsmiling face to see what manner of person had accosted her. Then she exclaimed in astonishment, "Why, Phil Tremont, how ever did you get on without my seeing you? I looked and thought you must have gotten left." Then, realizing that the train was well under way, and they had been carried some distance past the station, she cried in alarm, "But you can't get off. They're carrying you away." She was almost wringing her hands in her excitement. "Well, I don't mind it if you don't," said Phil, sitting down beside her and laughing at her concern. "I'm going along with you. Something Miss Roberta said last night on her way home started me to thinking, and the result was I decided to spend another day and night in Bower. It's positively my last appearance. However, I leave for good in the morning." What Roberta could have said to make such a change in his plans was more than Mary could imagine. She almost had to bite her tongue to keep from asking, and Phil, knowing that he had aroused her wildest curiosity, laughed again, but he wasted no more time in teasing her. "No, really," he said, "I was joking. A telegram from my firm routed me out about 6 o'clock this morning. They wanted me to go to St. Louis to see some parties before returning to New York. I figured it out that I could double things up there, so as to give me one more day here, but it took me so long to figure it that by the time I had made up my mind, there was only a moment to stuff my things into my suitcase and call a taxicab. When I got down to the station, I saw I had about 3 minutes in which to snatch a sandwich and a cup of coffee at the lunch counter. But the coffee was so hot, I came near missing my train, had to run a block and swing up on the rear platform. If it had been the regular express, I couldn't have caught it. Luckily, it was a freight, so here I am." He did not add that an unaccountable impulse to go back to Bower had seized him the night before when he bade her good night, or that the impulse had been strengthened afterward by a casual remark of Roberta's about Lieutenant Boglin. Roberta thought she saw the first symptoms of a budding romance on Bogey's part, not being given to the practice of analyzing his feelings. Phil did not stop to ask himself why it should make any difference to him what the lieutenant thought of little Mary Ware, nor did he realize at the time how much that remark influenced his decision to spend one more day with her. Afterwards, he used to say that it was fate, and not himself, that was responsible for that journey. That it was destined from the beginning he should chase madly after that freight train, catch it, and thereby give himself for long uninterrupted hours in which to grow better acquainted with her than he had ever been before. At the end of that time, he knew why he had been drawn back. It was that her real self, the depth of whose charm he had not even half suspected, should be revealed to him in the intimacy of this conversation. It changed his whole attitude toward her, to find how much she had changed herself, how she had grown and developed. In some way she was still the amusing child whose unexpected sayings had first attracted him. She would always be that, but she was so much more now, and again, as on the day he met her in the field of blue bonnets. He found himself watching her, trying to decide just wherein her charm lay, and how it made her different from any other girl he had ever known. Sometimes he would almost lose what she was saying, puzzling over the problem. At the stone quarry, while they waited a long time for the engine to switch off some empty cars and pick up some loaded ones, they left the coach and walked up and down beside the truck. They were talking about Gay and Alex, and he laughed at her outspoken honesty in expressing her opinion about their delayed wedding. "I think it's so sensible for them to wait till he's got something saved up for a rainy day. When he's nothing now but his practice, it's like providing a sort of financial umbrella. Really, it is like staring out without a sign of an umbrella when you know it's going to rain, and trusting to luck to keep you dry, for people to marry with nothing to depend on but an uncertain salary." Phil laughed as he answered, "What a little pessimist you are, Mary. It doesn't always rain, and people have married without such a provision who lived happily ever after." "But it does oftener than it doesn't," she insisted. "Papa and Mama lived happily, and he had only his practice as a young lawyer. But look what we've been through since he died. Things would have come to such a pass when his health broke down if there had been something laid away for such emergencies. Joyce and I have often talked about it when we've had to pinch and work and economize down to the last cent." "So you'll never marry a man who has only the shelter of a salary to offer you?" said Phil teasingly. "I didn't say that," answered Mary, her face puckered up into a puzzled expression. "I don't want to, and I don't think I would, but, honestly, I don't know what I would do. I'm afraid that if I loved a man as much as you ought to be his wife, that I'd be every bit as foolish as anybody else, and that I'd marry him even if I had to take in back stairs to scrub for a living. But I do hope I'll have more sense, or else he won't be that kind of a man. It isn't that I mind walk," she added, "but I'm so tired of doing without any making over, and tugging and pulling to make both ends meet. Do you know what they call me at home? The watchdog of the treasury, and you can guess what I've had to be like to earn such a name. I earned it too, all right. I forked over every penny, and I hate to keep on in the same old rut all the rest of my days. It would be so nice to look forward to a luxurious old age. She laughed when she had said it, but such a tired little sigh came first, and that wistful look again in her honest, straightforward eyes as she glanced up at him, that he was seized with a sudden desire such as no one else had ever inspired before, to pick her up and carry her away from all her troubles, to surround her with all the girlish pleasures and pretty things she loved, and to humor every whim all the rest of her life. But all he said was, "And if you were a man, I suppose you would feel the same way about it." "Oh, more so," she cried. "The more I thought of a girl, the surer I'd want to be that she needed never face that rainy day unprotected." She stopped to pick a tiny yellow star from a clump of broom growing alongside the truck, and they walked on in silence a moment. Then he said, with an amused side glance at her, "You can't imagine how funny it seems to hear such common sense, practical side talks on matrimony from an 18-year-old girl like you. I feel as if I'd had a scolding from my grandmother, and that I'll have to own up that I did it. But I'm sorry, and I'll never do it again." "Did what?" queried Mary in surprise. "Spent everything as fast as I made it. I had money to burn, and burn it. I don't ask any better salary than I've been receiving for several years. Of course, when I go in by myself, that'll be another matter, but I'll have to own up. Out of it all, I've saved practically nothing. I haven't spent it in riotous living, and it doesn't seem that I've been particularly extravagant. But it's gone. It just slipped through my fingers." "Oh, well, you," began Mary. "That's different." "In what way is it different?" he persisted, when she did not go on. "Well, if a man doesn't mind getting wet himself, it's nobody's business if he takes chances. It's the man who expects to have someone else to protect, who ought to be ready for the possible storms." "But what makes you think that I'll always go it alone?" insisted Phil. "That I'll never have anyone to protect? That's what you seem to insinuate." He was looking directly into her eyes, laughingly, teasingly, and a wave of color swept over her face. Roberta would have evaded the question and turned it off with a laugh. Mary was too simple and direct. It was the moment she had long felt must confront her some time. Her day of reckoning had come for playing eavesdropper. No matter how hard she fought against doing so, she knew she was going to confess that she had been one, albeit unintentionally. As he repeated his question with smiling insistence, the words struck in her throat, but the thought uppermost in her mind, called out to him by some strange telepathic power, and he understood as if she had spoken. "You think," he said slowly, looking into her eyes as if the written words were actually before him there, and he was reading them aloud. "You think that it is on Lloyd's account? How did you know about that?" It startled her so that he should read her thought in such a way that she could only stammer in reply. I heard you singing to her once at the Locusts, that song you sung last night, 'Till the Stars Are Old,' and I thought if you cared for her as it sounded both times, that there couldn't be anyone else ever." Phil turned partly away from her and stared off towards the hill a moment. His eyes narrowed into a thoughtful, musing expression. Finally, he said, "I thought so too, Mary, once. I thought it for a number of years. That time will always be one of the sweetest and most sacred of my memories. One's earliest love always is, they say, like the first white violet in the spring." There was a long pause. Then he finished the sentence by turning around to her to say, significantly, "But there's always a summer after every spring, you know. Come on, we'd better be getting aboard again. It looks as if they're about ready to start." He helped her up the steps and followed her down the aisle, while adjusting the window shade before she took her seat. He began to talk of other things, and the subject was dropped between them, but it was not dropped in Mary's mind. She had been called on to adjust herself to a new viewpoint of him so quickly that it left her mentally gasping. With his own hand, he had ruthlessly swept away one of her dearest illusions. She had always believed that no matter who else might forget, he would always stand as a model of manly constancy. What surprised her now was not his change of view, it was her own. By that one sentence, he had made it perfectly clear to her that it was not reasonable to expect him to go on mourning always for the first white violet. It was only natural that summer should follow the spring. But the puzzle now was, who was good enough and sweet and high and fine enough to follow Lloyd? Mary was positive that there was nobody. He might hunt the whole world over, but she was sure he would be doomed to disappointment in the end. Her motherly concern over that was almost as great as her sympathy had been when she thought of him as doomed to carry a secret sorrow with him to the grave. After that, the conversation was not so personal. It was nearly noon when they reached Bower, and in that time they had exchanged views on enough subjects to have filled an encyclopedia. Twice after that they talked together alone. The first time was when they went out in the boat just before sunset. Mary wanted him to see Fernbank in all its glory of fresh April greenness, with the little waterfalls splashing their fine mist over the walls of delicate maiden hair. She insisted on poling the boat, although he protested that it made him uncomfortable to sit still and see her doing the work. He refused to go at all until she compromised by saying he might pole on the way back. "It isn't walk," she insisted. "It's one of the greatest pleasures I have, and about the only one I've had in this benighted place." "You always did love to paddle your own canoe and strike out and do things for yourself," he remarked as they shot swiftly up the stream. By the way, what are you going to do next? Will you be starting back to Warwick Hall again in September, now that Jack is sure of taking his old position in the mines then? No, was her decided answer. We've scrapped about that lad lately. He insists that I must, but it's this way. He's lost a whole year out of his life, and although he's never said so, I know the time is coming when he'll want to settle down and have a home of his own. And he's the kind who'd never ask a girl to marry him until he'd provided for her future, in case anything should happen to him. Joyce's plans have been put back a year too. She has her heart set on going to Paris with Miss Henrietta to study, just as soon as she can afford it. Of course, Jack will pay back his part of what she's spent on us this winter, but it will take a good while for him to do it. I've made up my mind. I'm not going to stand in their way. I'll not be dragged on either one of them. There's lots of things that I can do. The summer is already provided for. When Mrs. Mallory found that we are going to stay on here till September, till Jack is strong enough to go back to work, she made up her mind to stay too, no matter how hot it gets, because the children are so happy here. They can bear the idea of stopping their lessons. They're beginning to learn to read now, and are as wild over that as if it were a new game. Mrs. Rochester says it does get frightfully hot here in the summers, but that we can stand it if we have the lessons in the morning instead of afternoon. And then? Asked Phil. After that? After that, I don't know, but there'll be something. It's all uncertain, but it's interesting just to wonder what will come next. I'm like the wolf in the last of the Mowgli stories. She turned to glance over her shoulder as she quoted, laughingly, "The stars are thin," said Gray Brother, sniffing at the dawn wind. "Where shall we lair today? For from now we follow new trails." I don't know where the new trails will lead, but from all that's happened in the past, I've faith to believe that there'll be good hunting in them. There will always be that for you, said Phil warmly. You'll never strike one where you'll not find friends and interests, and he started to say more, but checked himself, and after an instant's pause stood up, almost upsetting the boat, and laughingly took the oar away from her, insisting that he couldn't sit still another minute. He had to work off some of his surplus energy. What he had come near saying when he checked himself was, "And you'll never strike a trail where you won't be the bravest, jolliest, dearest little comrade a man could have, one that he would never tire of, one who could inspire him to do and be his best." The impulse to say all this came upon him so suddenly that it startled him. Then a sober second thought told him that after all she was scarcely more than a child, that she had always looked upon him as an elderly brother, and that it would be better not to destroy that old intimate relationship until he was sure of being able to establish a new one. A strange feeling of humility took possession of him. It suddenly seemed that he had so little to offer one who could give so much. Even her opinion which he had laughed at the stone quarry, about providing a financial umbrella, carried weight now, and made him hesitate, no longer confident of himself. His strong, quick sweeps of the oar sent the boat upstream at twice the speed it had been going before, and Mary, from her seat in the stern, called out that it was as good as flying, and that she'd have to acknowledge that she'd never know before how delightful it was to sit still and let somebody else do the paddling. But that was because nobody else had taken her along so fast. At Fernbank, they did not get out of the boat. Phil took the seat facing her, while they drifted around the deep pool for a little while. It was almost twilight there, for the high bank shut out the glow of the sunset, and it was deliciously cool and green and still. Presently some remark of Phil's made Mary exclaim, "That reminds me, although I don't know why it should, of something I've been intending to tell you, that Joyce wrote recently. You've heard her talk of little Jules Cissot, the boy who played such an important part in her winter in France. He lived in a house with giant scissors on the gables, and over the great gate, you know. Well, he's over here in America now. He's always wanted to come ever since Joy told him so much about it. His mother was an American, and I think he was born in this country. At any rate, he's here now, sightseeing and trying to hunt up his mother's family. He's come into quite a large fortune lately, ever so many 100,000 francs. As he is of age, he can do as he pleases. Joyce says he wants to come out to Lone Rock to see us, because she used to entertain him by the hour with tales of us, and he used to envy us our good times together in the little brown house at Plainsville. He never knew any home like ours. I'm wild to see him. Joyce says he is charming. Such lovely manners, and such a sensitive, refined face, like one's ideal of a young poet. He's really something of an artist. Joyce says he's done some really creditable work, and all her friends have taken him up and are making it nice for him while he is in New York." "That is interesting," said Phil. "I'll look him up as soon as I get back. Wouldn't it be romantic if the friendship that started between them as children should grow into something more? All those inherited francs would provide the fine large umbrella which you seem to think is necessary." "Oh, it never can be anything but friendship in this case," exclaimed Mary. "Jules is 2 years younger than Joyce. By the same token, he is 3 years older than you. Maybe it's Joyce's little sister he will be taking an interest in." "You're as bad as Norman," replied Mary, calmly. "That's what he said. He thought he had something new to tease me about, but soon found out that it wouldn't work." Despite her indifference, Phil thought of the possibility again, many times that night before he fell asleep. Knowing the limited space of the cottage, he had taken a room at the Williams house, despite Mrs. Ware's protests, saying he would be over early in the morning for breakfast. But it seemed for a while that breakfast time would arrive before he could fall asleep. Things assumed formidable proportions in the darkness and dead quiet of the night that they never have by day, Away after midnight, he was still thinking of what Mary had said about the young Frenchman who had lately come into his fortune, and of what Roberta had said about Lieutenant Boglin. The face of the latter rose up before him. Not a particularly good-looking face, he thought, but it was a strong, likable one, and he had a sense of humor which made him good company, and a blarney stone turn of the tongue that would take with any girl. As for Jael Sisson, who had envied the Wares their home life, Phil knew all about the childhood of the lonely little lad left to the mercies of a brutal caretaker. Jules would only need to see Mary once, dear little homemaker that she was, to want to carry her away with him to his chateau beside the Loire. Before Phil finally fell asleep, he had decided just what he would say to Mary next morning, and that he would go early enough to make an opportunity to say it. It was early when he went striding down the road, across the footbridge, and took the short cut through a meadow to the back of the Ware cottage. But the preparations for breakfast were well under way when he reached the back porch, screened by morning glory vines. He saw the table set out there, with fresh strawberries at each place, wreathed in their own green leaves. Judging from the odors wafted through the door, chickens were broiling within exactly the right degree of delectable crispness, and coffee, which would be of amber clearness, was in the making. But the noises within the kitchen were not to be interpreted as easily as the odors. There was a banging and scuffling over the floor, muffled shrieks and broken sentences in high voices, choking with laughter. Not till he reached the open window and looked in could he imagine the cause of the uproar. Norman and Mary were wrestling and romping all over the kitchen, having a tug of war over something he was trying to take away from her. Unconscious of a spectator, they dragged each other around, bumping against walls amid a clatter of falling tinware, stumbling over chairs, and coming to a deadlock in each other's arms in a corner, so full of laughter they could scarcely hold their grip. "Dare me again, will ya?" gasped Norman, thinking he had her pinned to the wall. But, wrenching one hand free, she began to tickle him until he writhed away from her with a whoop and dashed out of the door. "Ya afraid cat?" she jeered after him. "Afraid of a tickle? You just wait till I get back with the milk," he cried, catching up a shining tin pail that stood on the bench, and staring down the path over which Phil had just come. "You'll have to hurry," she called after him. "Breakfast is almost ready." She stooped to open the oven door and peep at the pan of biscuit within, just beginning to turn a delicate brown. Then she looked up and caught sight of Phil. He was leaning against the window looking in, his arms crossed on the sill, as if he had been enjoying the spectacle for some time. "For mercy's sakes," she exclaimed, "how long have you been there?" The coast was clear. Norman was well on his way to the Met's place, and Mrs. Ware was helping Jack get ready for breakfast. It was as good an opportunity as Phil could have hoped for to repeat the speech he had rehearsed so many times the night before, and she looked so fresh and wholesome and sweet, standing there with her pink morning dress, with the big white apron, that she was more like an apple blossom than anything else he could think of. He wanted to tell her so, to tell her she had never seemed so dear and desirable as she did at this moment, when he must be going away to leave her. Yet how could he tell her, when she was all a giggle and a dimple and a glow from her romp with Norman? Clearly, she was too far from his state of mind to share it now, or even to understand it. After all, she was only a little girl at heart, only 18. It wasn't fair to her to awaken her quite yet, to hurry her into giving a promise when she couldn't possibly know her own mind. He would wait. So he only leaned on the window sill and laughed at her for having been cocked in such an undignified romp, and asked her when she intended to grow up, and if she ever expected to outgrow her propensity for scrubbing. But when he had joked thus a few minutes, he said, quite suddenly and seriously, "Mary, I want you to promise me something." She was taking the chickens from their broiler and did not look at him until they were safely landed in the hot platter awaiting them. But she said lightly, "Yes, your Highness, to the half of me kingdom." "What is it?" "Well, I am going away, and I may not see you again for a long time. The chief wants me to take a position, engineering the construction of a big dam down in Mexico. It would keep me down there 2 years, but it would be the biggest thing I've had yet, in every way. Last night I just about made up my mind I'd take it. While I'm gone, you will be striking out into all sorts of new trails, and I am afraid that on some of them somebody will come along and try to persuade you to join him on his, even if you are such a little girl. Now, I want you to have a hand in choosing the right man, and I want you to promise me that you won't let anybody persuade you to do that till I come back, or at least, if they do try, that you'll send me word that they're trying, and give me a chance to come back and have a look at the fellow, and see if I think he is good enough to carry you off." "Why the idea?" She laughed, a trifle embarrassed, but immensely pleased that he should think it possible for her to have numerous suitors, or to have them soon, and flattered that he should take enough interest in her future to want to be called back from Mexico to direct her choice. "But will you promise?" he urged. "Yes, that is not much to promise." "And you'll give me your hand on it?" he persisted. "Yes, and cross my heart and body in the bargain," she added lightly, "if that'll please you any better." For all his gravity, she thought he was jesting, until she reached her hand through the window to seal the compact. "You know," he said, as his warm fingers closed over it, "I've never yet seen anybody whom I considered good enough for little Mary Ware." Her eyes fell before the seriousness of his steady glance, and as she turned away, all in a flutter of pleasure that the best man should have said such a lovely thing about her. It was the very thing she had always thought about him. Mrs. Ware came out just then, wheeling Jack in his chair, and soon after Norman was back with the milk, and breakfast was served out on the porch among the morning glories. A perfect breakfast and a perfect morning, Phil said. The bath which was to call for him came while they were still lingering around the table, and there was only time for a hasty good-bye all around. "Come and walk out to the gate with me, Mary, and give me a good send-off," he said, hurriedly snatching up his suitcase. Now, in this last moment, when there was much to say, neither had a word, and they walked along in silence until they reached the gate. There he turned for one more hand clasp. "Remember your promise," he said gravely, as his fingers closed warmly over hers. "I meant every word I said." "I'll remember," she answered, dimpling again, as if he had reminded her of a good joke. "And I'll keep my word. Honest, I will." With that he went away, carrying him with a picture which he recalled 1,000 times in the months that followed. Mary, standing at the gate in the pink and white dress that had the freshness of a spring blossom, with her sweet, sincere eyes and her dear little mouth saying, "I'll keep my word. Honest, I will." It was a long, long hot summer that followed. The drought dried up the creek, so that the boat lay idle on the bank. The dust grew deeper and deeper in the roads, and lay thick on the wayside weeds. Even the trees were powdered with it. All the green of the landscape took on an ashen grayness. Meadows lay parched and sere. Walking ceased to be a pleasure, and as they gasped through the tropical heat of the endless afternoons, they longed for the dense shade of the pines at Lone Rock, and counted the days till they could go back. But as soon as the sun dropped behind the hills each day, and the breeze started up from the far-away Gulf, their discomfort was forgotten. In the wonderful brilliance of the starry nights when there was no moon, or in the times when one hung, like a luminous pearl, above a silver world, the air grew fresh and cool, and they sat late in the open, making the most of every minute. In the early mornings there was that same crisp freshness of the hills again, so one could endure the merciless yellow glare and the painting heat of the afternoons, for the sake of the nights and dawns. Even without that, however, they would have been content to stay on, enduring it gladly, for Jack was daily growing stronger, and to see him moving about the house on his own feet, no matter how falteringly at first, was a cause for hourly rejoicing. Mary still played the part of Baloo with brother and sister, starting early in the morning and taking them over to the old mill dam in the shade of some big cypress and sycamore trees. She was teaching them to read and write, but there was little poring over books for them. They built their letters out of stones, and fashioned whole sentences of twigs, wrote them in the sand, and muddled them in mud, scratched them on rocks with bits of flint, as Indians do their picture language, and pricked them in the broad sycamore leaves with thorns. By the end of the summer they had enough of a vocabulary to write a brief letter to their father, and their pride knew no bounds when each had achieved one entirely alone, from date to stamp, and dropped it into the bags at the post office. His pride in them was equally great, and the letter that he sent Mary with her final check was one of the few things which she carried away from Texas as a cherished memento. She did not write often in her Good Times book. There was so little to chronicle. An occasional visit from the Barnabys, a call at the rectory, a few minutes spent in neighborly gossip in the Met's garden. Never once in the whole summer a happening more exciting than that, except when the troops from Fort Sam Houston were ordered out in their annual hike and passed through Ware in July. Each of the different divisions camped a day and a night in the grove back of the cottage, near enough of the Wares to watch every maneuver. The artillery band played at sunset when it was in camp, and gave a concert that night in the plaza. When the cavalry passed through, Lieutenant Boglin came to supper and spent the evening. Gay was up for a day twice, and Mary went once to San Antonio. That was all, yet stupid as it was for a girl of her age, and much as she missed young companionship. Mary managed to get through the summer very happily. All its unpleasantness was atoned for one day in early September, when she looked out to see Jack going down the road, straight and strong, pushing his own wheeled chair in front of him. He was taking it down to Dr. Mackay's office to leave. "For the first poor devil who needs it," he said. In the last few weeks he had discovered what he had not known before, that the town was full of invalids in quest of health, attracted from all over the country by the life-giving air of its hills. He had made an acquaintance of a number of them since he had been able to ride around with the doctor. Now, as he went off down the road with the chair, with all of the family at the window to see the happy sight, Mrs. Ware repeated to Mary what the doctor had said about Jack's effect on his other patients, and what the rector had told her of the regard all the villagers had for Jack. "The dear boy's year of suffering has done one thing for the world," she added. "It has given it another Aldebaran. Don't you remember the jester's sword?" She quoted it readily, because ever since she had first seen it, she had always read Jack's name in place of Aldebaran's. It came to pass whenever he went by, men felt a strange, strength-giving influence radiating from his presence, a sense of hope. One could not say exactly what it was so fleeting, so intangible, like warmth that circles from a brazier, or perfume that is wafted from an unseen rose. That's what one feels whenever Jack comes near. "Yes, I know," assented Mary. "Even old Mr. Metz tried to say as much to me about him. He didn't choose those words, of course, but in his own broken way he meant the same thing." When the day came to leave, there was no one to go with them to the station. The Rochesters were away on their vacation, and it was too early in the morning for the Barnabys to come in from the ranch. They had bidden each other good-bye the day before, with deep regrets on both sides. It seemed so good to both Mary and her mother to see Jack attending to the tickets and the trunks in his old way, so quick and capable. While he was getting the checks, Mary walked down the track a little piece to a place where she could look back at the town for one more picture to carry away in her memory. How friendly and homelike and dear it seemed now. Between the belfry of St. Peter's and the great tower of Holy Angels rose the smoke from many breakfast fires, and the windmills twirled merrily in the morning sun. For all its dreariness, she was carrying away the recollection of a score of happy times. Over there was the free camp yard, where their little Christmas tree had spread such cheer. Further on shone the spire of St. Boniface. She would always think of it as she saw it Easter morning, its casement windows set wide, and its altar white with the snowy beauty of the rain lilies. There was the meadow through which she had gone in blue-bonnet time, to find Phil waiting under the huge aged tree, and there the creek, running on to Fern Bank. Nearer by she could see the windmill tower she had so often climbed, sticking up over the roof that had sheltered them during the 10 months they had been in Bower. Dear little old Bower, she thought, gratefully. She wouldn't have believed it in the beginning if anyone had told her that there would be any regrets in her leave-taking when the time came to go. How wonderful it had all turned out! The crooked had been made straight, and the rough places smooth. She could face the future gladly, buoyantly, now, no matter what it held, since Jack was well again. "Come on, Mary, it's time to go aboard," called Norman. "You go on in and save me a seat," she called back. "Here come the children. I must wait to speak to them." She had bidden them good-bye the night before, and had not expected to see them again. They came running, out of breath. Sister had a little bag of animal crackers she had brought as a farewell offering, and Brad proffered a companion piece, a sack of sticky red cinnamon drops. They had cried the night before, and they were close to tears now, realizing that something more rare and precious was passing out of their lives. She took their offerings with thanks and brought smiles to their dejected little faces, then once more stooped to kiss them good-bye. "From now it's new trails for all of us," she said, lightly, "and you'll write and tell me what you find in yours, and I'll write and tell you about mine." On the platform of the car, she turned for a last look at the 3 disconsolate little figures, waiting to watch her start off towards those new trails. There were 3, for Uncle August had joined them now, squatting mournfully beside them as if he, too, were losing his best playfellow. The train began to move slowly out, as she clung to the railing to wave to them one more time. A mournful little pipe followed her shrilly down the track. It was Brad's voice. "Good hunting, Miss Mary, good hunting." The end. End of chapter 15. Recording by Aries. End of Mary Ware in Texas by Annie Fellows Johnston.